My girlfriend made fun of my height to humiliate me, but when I mentioned her being overweight, she didn't like it. Before we go on, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which city you're tuning in from. I'm 24 years old, and I'm going to tell an experience I lived a few months ago, and that with time I understood that it was one of the most toxic relationships I have ever had. I'm not writing this to justify myself or to look good. I just want to tell the facts as they happened. I was dating Lucy, 22. Our relationship was not very long, but intense enough to leave me several lessons. At first, everything seemed normal, even very good. I had been single for quite some time before I met her, more than a year, and honestly, I was at a stage where I wanted something stable. Lucy had just ended a 3-year relationship with her ex, a guy named Saul. She said that relationship was already dead for a long time, that they had only stayed together out of habit, and that he had been very controlling with her. We knew each other from before we were a couple because we belonged to the same group of friends. We went to the same school and coincided in several classes. For months, we were just friends. We talked about simple things, homework, teachers, weekend plans. She was always very charismatic and easy to deal with, and that's why I never imagined how it would all end. The first 3 months as a couple were good. Not perfect, but peaceful. I tried to be attentive. I listened to her. I supported her when she had problems with school. I helped her study when she felt overwhelmed. I don't say this to make myself look like someone exemplary. That's simply how I am when I am with someone. I like to be present. Lucy was also very affectionate at first. She wrote me long messages. She told me she felt safe with me and that she liked that I was different from her ex. I was 1.68 m, which was never a problem for me. I'm not an insecure person because of my height, although I know I'm not tall. At that time, she never made comments about it. However, little by little attitudes began to appear that made me uncomfortable. At first, they were small things, almost imperceptible. For example, she started asking me for my location very frequently. At first, I thought it was out of insecurity, considering she came from a long and complicated relationship. I agreed not because I thought it was necessary, but because I didn't want to argue about something that seemed minor to me. After that, she started checking my social networks constantly. She would ask me who was such person who had reacted to a story or why they had commented something. I never found that behavior logical because I didn't give her reasons to distrust me. I didn't talk to other girls or hide anything. What confused me the most was that in private, Lucy was one person, and in public, she seemed like another. When we were alone, she was sweet, attentive, even vulnerable. She told me she was afraid of being left alone, that she didn't want to be abandoned. But when we were with our friends, especially with the group we both belonged to from before, her attitude changed. She started making comments that, although they seemed like jokes, were always aimed at minimizing me. At first, they were subtle things, like saying I was too quiet or that I didn't know how to react quickly. Sometimes she would laugh when she said something and then clarify, "It's a joke, don't get mad." I try not to give it importance. Over time, those jokes became more frequent and more direct. Comments about how I didn't know how to do certain things, that I was clumsy at others, or that I lacked character, always in front of others, never alone. Something that caught my attention a lot was that when someone in the group made a joke about her, Lucy would get quite upset. She didn't like to be the center of the jokes, even if they were light, but she didn't seem to have a problem doing it to me. One situation in particular stuck with me. We were sitting at a table outside the school, talking about future plans. One of our friends asked me what I planned to do after finishing my degree. I am studying law, and I have always been clear that I would like to work in a law firm. My uncle has a small one and has told me for a long time that if I put in the effort, I could join as an intern when I finish. I answered him normally explaining that. I wasn't bragging or anything like that. I just answered the question. Before I could finish speaking, Lucy interrupted me laughing and said, "Oh, babe, I'm sorry to break your heart, but I don't know why you studied law. How are you going to defend others if you can't even defend yourself?" Everyone laughed, some out of discomfort, others because they thought it was a harmless joke. I remained silent. I didn't know what to say at that moment. I felt she exposed me in front of everyone, not only as a partner, but as a person. What bothered me the most was not only the comment, but the tone. It didn't sound like an affectionate joke, but like a direct mockery. I felt she wanted to make me look bad in front of the group. After that, no one said anything. The conversation changed topic, and we continued as if nothing had happened. Lucy acted normal, even took my hand as if she hadn't done anything out of place. That night, I kept thinking a lot about what happened. It wasn't the first time she made a comment like that, but it was the clearest and the one that affected me the most. I started to wonder if I was exaggerating or if there really was a lack of respect. The next day, I decided to talk to her about it. I didn't want to do it in public or in front of the others. I asked her to meet after classes to talk. She agreed without problems, as if she didn't sense that something was wrong. We sat on a bench near the campus. At first, we talked about normal things until I told her I wanted to clarify something. I mentioned the comment she had made the day before and how it had made me feel. I explained that I didn't like her making fun of me in front of other people and that I found those kinds of comments unnecessary. Lucy, instead of listening to me calmly, became defensive almost immediately. She told me I was exaggerating, that it was just a joke, and that I was too sensitive. According to her, if I couldn't handle a comment like that, then I had an insecurity problem. I tried to stay calm and explain that it wasn't about insecurity, but about respect. I told her that I would never make a comment like that about her in front of other people. It was at that moment when the conversation started to get heated. Lucy crossed her arms, completely changed her expression, and told me that I always wanted to look like the victim, that she was just being honest, and that if it bothered me, it was because I knew she was right. There began the discussion as such. The discussion became more intense than I had planned. What started as a conversation to express a discomfort ended up becoming an exchange of reproaches. Lucy started talking louder, and so did I. We were both upset, although for different reasons. I reminded her of other similar situations, comments she had made in meetings with friends, unnecessary comparisons, small mockeries that she always justified by saying they were just jokes. I told her that it was not an isolated event, that it was constantly repeated, and that it made me feel bad, even if I had not expressed it so clearly before. She denied at first that it was a constant thing. She said I was exaggerating and taking things out of context. When I insisted and mentioned concrete examples, her attitude changed. Instead of responding to what I was saying, she diverted the conversation to my reaction. It was then when she blurted out a phrase that surprised me quite a lot. Boys today are all princesses. They can't handle anything. That comment didn't sit well with me, not only because of what it implied, but because I felt it completely invalidated what I was trying to tell her. At that moment, I stopped trying to explain myself. I felt there was no point in continuing to talk if every time I expressed something that bothered me, she reduced it to a weakness of mine. Without thinking too much about it, I replied, "Fine, then we're breaking up." I said it with a dry tone. It wasn't something I planned to say. It just came out. Lucy remained silent for a few seconds. Her expression completely changed. She went from being defensive to being nervous. "Babe, wait," she said right away. "I think you're very angry. Let's talk a little more." I was already tired. I felt that the conversation was going nowhere and that staying there was only going to make things worse. I got up from the bench and told her, "No, I'm leaving." I took a few steps, but I didn't get very far. I heard how she started to cry. It wasn't an exaggerated cry, but it was enough to make me stop. I turned around and saw her sitting with her head down, apologizing through tears. She told me she didn't want us to end up like this, that she had exaggerated and that it wasn't her intention to hurt me. Then she asked me something that put me in an uncomfortable situation. She told me to at least take her home, that she didn't feel well to return alone. I hesitated for a few seconds, but in the end I agreed. I didn't want to leave her crying there. During the trip, we hardly talked. The atmosphere was tense. I was still upset, and she seemed nervous, as if she feared that at any moment I would change my mind and leave her there. When we arrived at her house, before getting out of the car, she asked me to talk a little more about the subject. We sat there for a few minutes. She was the first to speak. "Babe, I think those are not ways to break up," she told me. "I love you. I don't want to break up over this. I'm sorry, it won't happen again." I was still upset. I answered her sincerely, although perhaps in a harsher way than necessary. "It's just that it's always the same with you," I told her. "You always end up saying it's a joke, that I exaggerate, and then it happens again." Lucy didn't answer immediately, She came closer and hugged me. She told me she understood that I was angry, that she had spoken without thinking, and that she really didn't want to lose me. Then she kissed me. I kissed her back. Over time, I have recognized that I made a mistake there. At that moment, however, I let myself be carried away. Part of me wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that she had truly understood what was bothering me and that she would change. I felt emotionally tired, and that show of affection was enough for me to let my guard down. We reconciled that night. She went into her house, and I left with the feeling that the problem was solved or at least contained. I thought that maybe I had exaggerated, that maybe I also had to learn not to take everything so much to heart. But the mockeries didn't end there. They were never again as direct or as obvious as before. Lucy was more careful. The comments became lighter, more subtle, disguised as humor or irony. They were no longer clear attacks, but small observations that added together continued to have the same effect. For example, if I hesitated before making a decision, she would make comments like, "Oh, you always think too much." If I preferred not to discuss a topic in front of the others, she would say things like it's that he doesn't like conflict. She never said it in an openly aggressive way, but the message was still there. In public, she continued to point out differences between how she treated me alone and how she did it in front of the others. In private, she was affectionate, attentive, even emotionally dependent. In a group, she seemed to need to reaffirm herself at my expense, even if indirectly. I, for my part, began to keep quiet about more things. Every time something bothered me, I remembered the previous discussion and how it had ended. I told myself it wasn't worth arguing over small comments. I began to normalize attitudes that would previously have made me much more uncomfortable. Over time, I realized that I had entered a dynamic in which I constantly gave in to avoid conflicts while she adjusted her behavior just enough not to cross an obvious line, but without really changing the root of the problem. The day when everything ended definitively was during a meeting with friends. It wasn't a big party or anything out of the ordinary. We were the same group as always, gathered in one of their apartments to hang out, have a drink, and talk. I had been feeling uncomfortable in those kinds of situations for a while, but I still went trying to convince myself that nothing would happen. Lucy had been drinking early. She wasn't completely out of control, but she was uninhibited enough to talk more than usual and without filters. From the moment we arrived, I noticed that her comments were more frequent and more direct. Constant jokes, exaggerated laughter, and an attitude that clearly sought attention. At first, I tried to ignore it. I stayed talking with other friends, avoiding being too close to her. However, at one point, I approached the group where Lucy was because they were talking about movies. One of the girls mentioned an actor. I don't remember which one. I just know it was someone well-known and considered attractive. Lucy joined the conversation and, without thinking too much about it, said, "My ex looked like him. Yes, he was super handsome, but while he was a son of A__, upon hearing that, I felt an immediate discomfort. I didn't think it was right for her to talk like that about her ex in front of me, and even less comparing him to an actor. I looked at her with obvious annoyance. She realized it, and, instead of stopping, looked back at me with an ironic smile. What did she say? He may be a son of A__, but I can admit that he was handsome. Then she paused briefly, stared at me, and continued. Why break up with you? About you, I will say that well. She was silent for a few seconds, as if she were looking for the best way to finish the sentence. Then she smiled and said, I will say that you were very short. She and the other girl she was talking to started laughing. I stood still, not knowing how to react. I felt a mixture of shame, anger, and tiredness. It wasn't the first time she made a comment about my height, but it had never been so direct or so humiliating. Far from stopping there, Lucy seemed even more encouraged to see the reaction of the others. She started to behave as if she were doing an improvised comedy routine. She raised her voice a little so everyone could hear her and said, I'm sorry, but it does embarrass me a little that you are so short. Wear heels or something like that. The laughter increased. Some tried to hide it. Others laughed openly. I felt the floor collapsing on me. Lucy continued, not caring how I looked or how I felt. Just a few more centimeters would be fine, she added. That way I wouldn't feel like I'm with a middle school boy. That was the point where I stopped trying to contain myself. I felt she had crossed a very clear line. It was no longer an isolated joke or a subtle comment. It was a public, repeated, and conscious humiliation. I stared at her and told her in a calm but firm tone, "Oh, do you want to talk about physics? I see. So, why don't we mention you're overweight?" The atmosphere changed immediately. Some laughs faded. Others continued out of surprise. Lucy remained silent for a few seconds, clearly disoriented. I kept talking, driven by the mixture of accumulated anger and the feeling of being fed up. "It's just that, babe, it cannot be possible that I eat 3 pieces of pizza and you eat the other 5, I said. She looked at me with an expression of disbelief. Some in the group started laughing again, this time more nervously. I continued without stopping. "You say your clothes shrink very fast from washing them," I added. "I think maybe you should accept that you are no longer a size L. Accept and embrace that XL." The laughter increased. I felt that something had gotten completely out of control. But at that moment, I didn't care anymore. For the first time, I wasn't the one who was being the passive target of the jokes. One of the girls in the group commented with a laugh. "You finally gave it back to her." Lucy was no longer laughing. Her face had changed completely. She looked upset, humiliated, and furious. Without saying anything, she got up from the armchair where she was sitting and walked directly towards me. Before I could react, she raised her hand and slapped me hard on the face. The sound was dry and clear. Immediately, all laughter stopped. No one said anything for a few seconds that felt eternal. Lucy was the first to speak. She looked at me with rage, with eyes full of anger, more than sadness, and told me, "You are an idiot." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't feel the need to do so. My face was hot from the blow, but more than physical pain, what I felt was tiredness, a deep tiredness accumulated for months. I looked at her and replied, "I was already fed up with you. I think now it is time to break up." It wasn't an impulsive phrase. It wasn't something said just out of the anger of the moment. Actually, I felt it was the only logical thing I could say after everything that had happened. Lucy held my gaze for a few seconds and then replied with a cold tone, "Well, get out." "I don't care." I didn't say anything else. I took my things and left the apartment. No one tried to stop me. No one followed me. I walked a couple of blocks before realizing that I was shaking, not from the cold, but from the emotional discharge. That night, I arrived at my house with a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The following days were silent on my part. I didn't look for her. I didn't write to her. I didn't try to clarify anything else. I felt that everything had been made clear. However, Lucy did start to express herself, although not directly with me. She began to post constantly on social networks, stories, publications, and phrases related to feminism, talking about how many men today were not gentlemen, about how they didn't know how to respect a woman, and about how machismo was still present even in apparently healthy relationships. She didn't mention my name, but the context was obvious to anyone who knew us. At first, I avoided reading the comments. I didn't want to get involved any further or reopen something that was already closed for me. But eventually curiosity got the better of me, and I went in to see one of those posts. Some comments surprised me quite a lot. One of our friends wrote, "Like when you break up for being a bully with your boyfriend and you don't accept it." Another commented something that, although it sounded like a joke, made it clear that many had seen what happened from the outside. "A doubt, now that you are alone, do you eat all the pizza or only the 5 pieces?" I won't deny that reading that generated mixed feelings. On the one hand, I felt some validation. For a long time, I thought maybe I was exaggerating, that maybe the problem was my sensitivity. Seeing that other people noticed the same behavior made me feel less confused. On the other hand, I also understood that the environment in that group was not healthy. Although some comments were directed at Lucy, the fact that everything turned into public mockery indicated that the problem was not just between the two of us. There was a dynamic of mockery and exposure that didn't benefit anyone. Over the weeks, I drifted away from that group of friends. It was not an impulsive decision. I simply stopped attending meetings, I stopped participating in group conversations, and little by little the contact was lost. I understood that if they made fun of her in that way, They had also been part of the problem when the mockery was towards me. Today, several months later, I can see the situation more clearly. I realize that I should have ended the relationship much sooner when the first disrespect appeared. I thought that giving in, keeping quiet, and minimizing what I felt would avoid conflicts. But in reality, it only allowed everything to accumulate until it exploded in the worst way. I'm not proud of having mentioned her overweight. I know it was an impulsive reaction, and that although I felt attacked, it doesn't justify having attacked in the same way. However, I also understood something important. When a relationship reaches the point where both publicly hurt each other, there is nothing healthy left to save. I learned that respect is not negotiable, neither in private nor in public, and that breaking up sooner, even if it hurts, is always better than staying until resentment turns everything into something you no longer recognize.